The transport truck rumbled to a halt outside the field hospital compound on Okinawa, its engine sputtering in the humid air of late June 1945. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell stood at the entrance of the medical tent, her nurse's uniform already clinging to her skin in the oppressive heat. She watched as Army MPs began unloading their cargo, 12 Japanese prisoners of war, most barely able to stand. The men who stumbled from the truck bore little resemblance to the fearsome soldiers depicted in training films. Their uniforms hung in tatters, stained with mud and blood. Several clutched wounds that had received only the most rudimentary battlefield treatment. Their faces, gaunt and hollow-eyed, held expressions Sarah had seen before, the 1,000-yard stare of men who had witnessed too much. Captain Robert Henderson, the chief medical officer, emerged from the main hospital tent and approached Sarah. "Lieutenant, these men are your responsibility now. Treat them the same as our own wounded. That's a direct order from command." Sarah nodded, though she noticed the tension in several nearby corpsmen. Private James Walsh, a medic from Brooklyn, stood with his arms crossed, his jaw clenched. His brother had died at Tarawa. Corpsman Daniel Chen, whose family had fled Japanese occupation in China, stared at the prisoners with unreadable eyes. "I need everyone focused," Sarah said quietly to her team. "These are patients now. Nothing more, nothing less." The first prisoner collapsed before reaching the tent. Sarah rushed forward, catching him before his head struck the ground. Up close, she could see he was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps 19 or 20. His breathing came in shallow gasps, and his skin burned with fever. "Get him inside now," she ordered. "Possible pneumonia or infection. Walsh, prep a cot in the isolation area." The young soldier's eyes flickered open as they carried him. When he saw Sarah's face hovering above him, his expression shifted to something between fear and confusion. He mumbled something in Japanese, his voice barely audible. "It's all right," Sarah said softly, knowing he couldn't understand. "You're safe now." Inside the tent, the reality of their condition became clearer. Most suffered from malnutrition, dehydration, and untreated wounds. 2 had severe dysentery. One man's leg wound showed signs of gangrene. As Sarah and her team worked through initial assessments, she noticed how the prisoners watched them, not with the defiance she'd expected, but with wary bewilderment. The youngest prisoner, the one who had collapsed, drifted in and out of consciousness as Sarah cleaned and dressed a suppurating wound on his shoulder. When she offered him water, he initially refused, turning his face away. She left the canteen beside his cot and moved to the next patient. By evening, the team had stabilized the most critical cases. Sarah sat outside the tent, allowing herself a moment to breathe. The sun hung low over the Pacific, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Corpsman Chen approached, his expression troubled. "Lieutenant, we're running low on sulfa drugs. If we use them on the prisoners, we might not have enough for our own wounded." Sarah had anticipated this. "How much do we have in reserve?" "Maybe enough for 3 weeks at current usage rates, but there's a convoy expected in 10 days. "Then we ration carefully for everyone," Sarah said. "American or Japanese, infection doesn't discriminate." Chen nodded slowly. "My grandmother told me stories about what the Japanese army did in Nanking. I thought I'd feel different seeing them like this, but they just look like scared kids." "That's because most of them are," Sarah replied. "War doesn't change that." Chapter 2. The Rations. 3 days into their treatment, the young prisoner with the shoulder wound, whom the team had come to call Kenji after Sarah heard another prisoner use the name, began to show signs of recovery. His fever had broken, and the infection was responding to treatment. But he still refused most food. Sarah noticed this pattern across several prisoners. They would accept water reluctantly, but turned away the sea rations and vegetable soup the medical staff offered. Private Walsh reported that the prisoners were saving portions of food, hiding them under their thin mattresses. "They think we're going to starve them," Sarah realized. "They're hoarding whatever they can." Captain Henderson frowned. "We can't force feed them, but if they don't eat, they won't heal. Some of them are already dangerously malnourished." That afternoon, Sarah tried a different approach. She entered the tent during the regular meal distribution, carrying her own mess kit. The prisoners watched silently as she sat on a supply crate between two cots. Slowly, deliberately, she opened her C ration and began eating. Kenji watched her from his cot, his dark eyes tracking every movement. Sarah took a spoonful of hash, chewed, swallowed. Then she reached for the extra ration she'd brought and held it out to him. He stared at the offering, then at her face, searching for some trick or cruelty. When she simply continued holding it out, maintaining eye contact, he slowly reached forward and took it. His hands trembled as he opened the tin. "It's okay," Sarah said gently. "It's real food. You need to eat to get stronger." Though he couldn't understand her words, something in her tone seemed to reach him. He took a small, tentative bite, then another. Within minutes, he was eating steadily, his body's desperate need for nourishment overriding his fear. Sarah repeated this pattern over the next several days. She would eat her own rations in the tent, sharing the space with the prisoners, normalizing the act of receiving food from their former enemies. Gradually, the other nurses and corpsmen joined her. The prisoners began to accept meals more readily, though their confusion remained evident. One evening, as Sarah was checking Kenji's healing wound, he spoke to her in halting, broken English. "Why? You give food?" She paused, surprised. "You speak English?" "Little. School. Before war." He struggled with the words. "American. Hate Japanese. Why you?" "Help?" Sarah chose her words carefully. "Because you're injured. Because you're human. That's enough." Kenji's expression showed he didn't quite believe her, but something shifted in his eyes, a crack in the wall of his expectations. The real test came on the 10th day. A supply convoy arrived, but it had been hit by artillery fire during transport. Several crates of medical supplies were intact, but much of the food had been destroyed or contaminated. Captain Henderson called an emergency meeting. "We have enough medical supplies for now, but rations are going to be tight for the next week until the next convoy. We need to reduce portions across the board." Sarah looked at the manifest. Even with rationing, their American wounded would receive adequate nutrition, but the Japanese prisoners, already malnourished, couldn't afford further reduction. "Sir, if we cut the prisoners' rations more, we'll undo all the recovery progress. Some of them will relapse." Henderson ran a hand through his graying hair. "I know, Lieutenant, but I can't justify giving enemy prisoners the same portions as our own men when supplies are short. The brass would have my head." That night, Sarah made a decision. She reduced her own portion by a third and gave the extra to the prisoners. When Corpsman Chen noticed, he quietly did the same. Then Walsh, then the other nurses. Within 2 days, the entire medical staff had voluntarily reduced their own rations to maintain the prisoners' recovery. Chapter 3. Shared Humanity. The prisoners noticed. It was impossible for them not to. They watched as the American medical staff grew visibly thinner, their faces drawn, while continuing to ensure the Japanese POWs received adequate nutrition. The atmosphere in the tent began to change. Kenji approached Sarah one morning as she was inventorying supplies. He bowed formally, then spoke in his careful English. "We see what you do. We see you. Give your food." Sarah tried to downplay it. "It's just temporary. New supplies will arrive soon." "No." Kenji shook his head firmly. "In Japanese army we learn, Americans are demons, cruel, without honor." He paused, searching for words. "But you share food when you have little. This is compassion. We do not understand." "What don't you understand?" "We are enemy. We fight your soldiers, kill your people. Why you show kindness?" Sarah set down her clipboard. "Kenji, can I tell you something? Before the war, I was a school teacher in Oregon. I taught children, some of them Japanese-American kids whose parents had immigrated. They were good students, good people. When the war started, their families were sent to internment camps. I couldn't stop it, couldn't help them. I felt powerless." She met his eyes. "I can't change what happened to them, I can't bring back the soldiers who died on both sides, but here, now, I can choose to see human beings who need help. That choice still means something. Kenji translated her words for the other prisoners. A long silence followed. Then, one of the older prisoners, a former sergeant who had lost his right arm to shrapnel, spoke in Japanese. Kenji translated. Sergeant Yamamoto says, "In his village there is saying, the bamboo that bends in the storm survives. And we thought survival meant being hard, unbreaking. But maybe. True strength is knowing when to bend, when to accept help, even from enemy." The next day, something remarkable happened. The prisoners began helping around the hospital compound. They couldn't do heavy labor in their weakened state, but they folded bandages, sorted supplies, and helped clean areas of the tent. When American wounded arrived from a nearby skirmish, several of the Japanese POWs assisted in carrying stretchers, their faces solemn as they handled men who days earlier might have killed them. Private Walsh watched this with visible internal conflict. During a break, he approached Sarah. "Lieutenant, I need to tell you something. When I first saw these guys, all I could think about was my brother. How he died on that beach, probably facing soldiers just like them. I wanted to hate them. And now? Now I see my brother in them. Young guys who got told to fight, who didn't really have a choice. That Japanese kid, Kenji, he reminds me of Tommy. Same age, same kind of scared eyes trying to look brave." Walsh's voice cracked slightly. "It doesn't make Tommy any less dead, but somehow, this feels like the right thing." The bond between staff and prisoners deepened when an unexpected crisis struck. A tropical storm hit Okinawa with devastating force, tearing through the compound. The medical tent's main support pole snapped, and the canvas began to collapse over the wounded, both American and Japanese. Without hesitation, Sergeant Yamamoto and two other prisoners threw themselves against the falling canvas, using their bodies to hold it up while staff evacuated the bedridden patients. Rain poured through the tiers in the tent, and the wind threatened to rip everything apart. Kenji, despite his healing shoulder, helped Walsh and Chen move an American soldier with both legs in casts to safety. For 20 minutes, they worked together in the storm's fury, nationality meaningless in the face of immediate danger. When the emergency passed and temporary shelter was established, Japanese and American alike sat exhausted in the mud, too tired to maintain the pretense of being enemies. Chapter 4. The Understanding. The new supply convoy arrived 6 days later, laden with food, medicine, and mail from home. As the staff opened their ration packs, full meals for the first time in over a week, the prisoners watched quietly from their section of the tent. Sarah noticed Kenji staring at a package she'd received. "It's from my mother," she explained, showing him the wrapped oatmeal cookies inside. "She sends them every month, though half the time they arrive as crumbs." On impulse, she offered him one. Kenji hesitated, then accepted it with both hands and a formal bow. He took a small bite, and his eyes widened slightly. "Sweet. Very good. Would you like to share them with the others?" Kenji's expression became serious. "Lieutenant Mitchell, why you continue to give? Now you have enough. You do not need to share anymore." Sarah considered her answer carefully. "Kenji, do you know why I became a nurse?" He shook his head. "When I was 10, my father got very sick. We were poor, and the local doctor could have refused to treat him. But he didn't. He came to our house every day for 2 weeks, and when my father recovered, he wouldn't accept payment. He said, 'Healing isn't about money or politics. It's about seeing someone who needs help and choosing to give it.' That lesson stuck with me." She gestured around the tent. "What we did these past weeks, sharing our rations, working together during the storm, that wasn't about sides or nations. It was about recognizing that suffering is suffering, and we all have the capacity to ease it." Kenji was quiet for a long moment, then he said, "Before war, I want to be teacher. Like you. I want to teach children about literature, poetry. But war comes and I am drafted. I fight because I must, because my family, my village, they depend on me to do duty. What will you do after the war? If I survive, maybe I teach again. Maybe I tell students what I learn here. He met her eyes. I tell them that enemies can show mercy. That former teacher can become nurse who shares food with enemy soldier. That maybe. Peace is possible. In the following weeks, as the prisoners recovered and prepared for transfer to a permanent POW camp, a quiet transformation took place. The Americans learned basic Japanese phrases. The prisoners taught them the proper way to fold origami cranes from medical paper, symbols of hope and healing. Sergeant Yamamoto, working one-handed, showed Walsh how to tie better surgical knots, a skill he'd learned as a fisherman before the war. On their last day at the field hospital, the prisoners gathered formally before the medical staff. Through Kenji's translation, Sergeant Yamamoto spoke. "We came here believing we knew what to expect. We thought Americans would treat us as we were taught you would, with cruelty and contempt. Instead, you gave us food when you had little. You treated our wounds as carefully as your own soldiers. You showed us that honor exists on both sides of war." He bowed deeply and the other prisoners followed. "We cannot change the past. We cannot undo the battles fought or the lives lost. But we will carry this memory forward, and perhaps someday it will mean something." Sarah felt her throat tighten. "It already means something," she said quietly. As the prisoners boarded the transport truck, Kenji turned back one last time. "Lieutenant Mitchell, thank you for showing me that even in war, humanity survives. I will not forget." After they left, Sarah found a small origami crane on her cot, folded from a scrap of bandage paper. Beside it was a note in careful English. "You taught me that kindness is stronger than hate. That is greatest lesson of all. Kenji." Captain Henderson found her there, holding the tiny paper crane. "You know, Lieutenant, what you and the team did? Sharing your rations like that technically violated protocol." "I know, sir. Good thing I never noticed it happening then." He smiled slightly. "The brass won't understand this. They'll file it away as an anomaly if it's reported at all. But those 12 men will remember. And everyone in this tent will remember. Sometimes, that's how change begins. Not with grand declarations, but with small acts of compassion that ripple outward." Sarah looked at the crane in her palm, its wings folded with precise care. Outside, the Pacific sun was setting again, painting the sky in those same shades of orange and red. But somehow the colors seemed different now, less like fire, more like hope. War would continue its brutal mathematics, battles won and lost, lives taken and saved. But in one small medical tent on Okinawa, a different equation had been proven, that even amid hatred and violence, humans could still choose mercy, that the simple act of sharing food could bridge an unbridgeable divide, that enemies could become, if not friends, then at least fellow travelers on the difficult road toward understanding. The crane's paper wings caught the fading light, casting a shadow that looked almost alive. Sarah carefully placed it in her footlocker, next to her mother's letters and her father's watch. Some memories, she knew, deserved to be kept safe. Not because they changed the world, but because they proved the world could still be changed one act of kindness at a time.